Hello everyone. Today in the EBD Seminar series we have Dr. Pol Pintanel Costa. He has developed his PhD here with Miguel Tejero and Gustavo Llorento from the University of Barcelona. But most of his work has happened across Ecuador, where he has been collaborating both across his PhD and also later during his postdoc with the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Ecuador, concretely participating of the conservation initiative called Balsa de los Sapos. And he has also been working for intermittently collaborating with here the station through Miguel Tejero and with the Universidad Central de Ecuador, where he's teaching at master's courses. Well, thank you very much, Paul. How are you feeling today?
Thank you very much, Agus. Fine. Here is 6 o'clock in the morning. I'm currently in Quito. So, well, thank you. Well, I'm going to start my presentation. As I was said, my name is Pol Pintanel, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've been working since my PhD until now. Basically, I work with amphibians, and within amphibians, I work with tadpoles. So to start my presentation, I'm going to start with this slide that maybe most of you know about. We know that species richness, endangered species, and endemic species are distributed, especially in the tropics. And within the tropics, they are distributed in mountainous areas. That's why Ecuador is a perfect country to work with because of its high biodiversity. Ecuador is the first most biodiverse country in amphibians when we are taking into account the density of amphibians per meter square, with more than 600 species described at the moment, and each year Ecuador is describing 10 more species. And that's because of the great diversity of biomas Ecuador has. It has the coast of Ecuador, it has the Andes, and also it has all the Amazonia. So it's a perfect lab to develop any kind of work. And especially, as I said, I think I said before, we work with tadpoles, and we work with tadpoles for many reasons. One, because of any ethical reasons, we can work with a lot of individuals without harming the population, or with harming less the population, and also because it's easier to measure the temperatures to which those organisms are exposed to. And that's because they inhabit in smaller habitats, normally, in small ponds. And also the temperature of those ponds are more homogeneous than temperatures, air temperatures, because water temperatures have higher heat conductivity, higher conductivity and higher heat capacity than terrestrial environments. That makes tadpoles have less scope for thermoregulation than terrestrial organisms. They can thermoregulate, but it's a little bit more difficult for them. And well, what about the variation of temperatures? Well, we know that mean temperatures increase in the tropics, and also the variation of the temperatures decreases in the tropics at lower absolute latitudinal degrees, because there is no seasonality in the tropics, while there is seasonality in more temperate areas. Something similar happens with elevation. Temperatures decrease with elevation, and also the variation of those temperatures increase with elevation. And well, all people that work in studies in physiological studies in tropical areas know about this very important article of Daniel Jansen. He was asking himself why mountain passes are higher in the tropics. So why tropical species have more problems to move in elevation, to distribute in elevation. And the history of why he had this idea was very interesting. Daniel Jansen was an ecological professor at Costa Rica, and during his projects, he had students from United States and a teaching assistant from Costa Rica, and they moved to different places, to different locations within Costa Rica, and he noticed something very interesting. That is that while the American students, the students from the United States, didn't have any problem with the cold in high elevation areas or the heat in low elevation areas, he realized that the teaching assistant was having a really bad time at those areas. He was sweating a lot at low elevation areas, and he was like putting a lot of clothes to avoid the cold. And he had a really nice idea. He proposed that because in tropical areas there is no seasonality, temperatures are quite constant along all the year, while in the temperate areas there is a seasonality, so temperatures are quite variable along the year. So he proposed that species should be adapted to the climate they are exposed to. So he suggested that tropical species should show narrower thermal tolerance breadths than temperate species because they are exposed to less variation of temperatures. And also he saw that because of this high variation in temperatures in temperate areas, temperatures across different elevations overlap most in temperate areas in comparison to tropical areas. So what he thought is that if tropical species are adapted to a specific elevation, they will have problems to move to another elevation, more problems to change these temperatures from one to another elevation than temperate species. And well, what many studies have found in ectotherms is that tropical species indeed have narrower thermal breadths than temperate species, and that's mainly because higher variation in cold tolerance rather than heat tolerance at large scales. This hypothesis is known as the heat invariant hypothesis. This idea also occurs in elevation, where heat tolerance seems to be less variant than cold tolerance at large geographical scales, both latitude and elevation, and there is an increase in thermal tolerance breadth because of a higher variation in cold tolerance. And this study of Jansen has awakened interest in many other areas. Maybe one of the more known areas is the Rappaport's rule. If temperate species show broader thermal tolerance breadth, we should also expect that those species have broader distributions, and that's what we found also with ectotherms. Also, if tropical species are more restricted to move from one to another elevation because of their physiological adaptations, we should expect also higher rates of speciation in the tropics in comparison to temperate areas. And well, for instance, in Ecuador, we found that many sister species are distributed in a pattern of one substituting the other in elevation, with different groups: poison dart frogs, Pristimantis, and tree frogs, and many others. And finally, well, the same way Jansen was doing his hypothesis based on spatial scales, but what happened with temporal scales. So the same way that mountain passes may be higher in the tropics, also climate change may be higher in the tropics, may have stronger effects in the tropics than in temperate areas. So that's also a thing that seems quite interesting. Tropical species seem to be more vulnerable to an increase of temperatures because one, they are exposed to higher temperatures, mean temperatures at least, and two, they show narrower thermal tolerance breadths. So what we did in our studies, we tried to measure all the temperature in situ on the habitats where species are found. So, for example, here we went to Mindo, it's a cloud forest near the city of Quito, and we measured the temperature into different habitats, two nearby habitats, a stream and a little puddle here and here, and we put it a data logger, and well, the temperatures are quite different. We found a lot of like a different maximum temperatures and a very different variation of those temperatures, and they also were quite different to the macroclimatic temperatures we found in big climatic databases. So what we did is measure temperature in situ, and also the species we found in those different areas in the stream and in these little puddles were also different. So that's quite interesting. And to measure physiology, we mainly used critical thermal maximum and critical thermal minimum, which are the range in which any organism can make its function. So normally temperatures close to those to City max or City min are normally lethal for the species. But also we also analyzed optimum temperature, which is normally in thermal performance curves. We see that performance increases constantly until it reaches a maximum performance at the optimal temperature, and then after this optimal temperature there is a drastic decrease on the performance. And to analyze those variables, City max and City min, we use a thermal bath, Hoover thermal bath, which allows us to increase or decrease the temperature of an individual until it stops responding to an external stimuli. And we use as a variable, we use the locomotor function. So when they stop moving, we decide at that point to be either City max or City min. And well, having all that, if we know the temperatures at which the organisms are exposed now, and how much they can tolerate, how much heat they can tolerate, we can assess the vulnerability of those species to an increase of temperature. So that's also a thing we did. So here I bring you some of the results. What we found is that both extreme maximum and minimum environmental temperatures decrease with elevation, but locally, like within an elevational band, we found that ponds show higher maximum temperatures than streams, but we don't find this difference in minimum temperatures. And when we see the physiological estimates, we see something similar. Both heat and cold tolerance decrease with elevation, being steeper, the decrease in City min. And also we found that species restricted, stream restricted species showed lower heat tolerances, lower City max than species, generally species or species that lives in ponds. What's really interesting here is that, well, as we know, with elevation, the thermal tolerance breadth increase, and that's because of a steeper decrease in cold tolerance. However, when we look at the local picture, when we look at the differences between habitats, we see that also the thermal tolerance breadth increases in species related to ponds in comparison to species related to stream habitats. However, what's really interesting here is that this broader thermal breadth is due to heat tolerance and not cold tolerance. So it seems that at local scales, higher thermal breadths are related to more variation in heat tolerance, while at larger scales, higher variability, higher thermal breadth are related to higher variation in cold tolerance, something I will talk lately. What's really interesting here, working with different groups of tadpoles in Ecuador, is that when we see here the group Hemiptactidae, Gastrotechas, this is the group we found at higher elevations, at more than 2,500 meters of elevation. However, when we look at their setemax, we see that it's quite similar to species found near the level of the sea. However, when we look to those same species, the cold tolerance of those same species are drastically lower. So they are like cold tolerant, they have a strong cold tolerant adaptation, which is really interesting. And well, when we look at the vulnerability of those species, which groups will be more vulnerable to climate change, we've seen that low elevation species and pond low elevation species will be the most vulnerable species theoretically, and within those species, pond species should be the most vulnerable. However, we are not taking into account that streams have a buffer effect on temperatures. So if there is any change in those streams, deforestation, droughts, it may have a more stronger effect on river species, which show lower heat tolerances than in pond species. So returning to what I was talking before, we are now working on another project that I think is quite interesting, that we've seen in different groups of animals, in ants, in reptiles, in amphibians, that normally at local scales, maximum temperatures are more variable than minimum temperatures. So normally night temperatures are quite constant. There is a variation, but the variation is lesser than maximum temperatures. In an open area, temperatures can be 5-6 degrees hotter than temperatures in forest. And we've also seen that when we compare tropical areas to temperate areas, also cold tolerance change a lot. For instance, when we go here in the coast in Ecuador, temperatures below 18 degrees, 16 degrees maybe. However, in Spain, temperatures can get temperatures close or even higher than the same temperatures than maximum temperatures in Ecuador. However, minimum temperatures can reach lowers. So what we think here is that obviously temperatures should be adapted to the temperatures they're exposed to. So we will expect that variation in city max and city mean would be different at local and large scales. For that, what we did was take information from different databases in amphibians, reptiles, and insects, and the results we find are really interesting. What we find is that normally at large scales we found that cold tolerance is more variable than heat tolerance. However, when we took the local scale, when we take individuals from a local scale, we see that heat tolerance is much more variable than cold tolerance. Also, we've seen that variation in thermal tolerance limit also change across trophic groups. So we based our study We based a study on this study of Miguel Tejedo 10 years ago, and he saw in a community of United States that predators, that Odonata predators and other kind of predators, had higher heat tolerances than amphibians and zooplankton. So we thought that this was probably due to those are temporary ponds. So probably Odonata take advantage of moments of drought that have higher mean and maximum temperatures to predate on other species, and that's why they have this different tolerance. So we wanted to see, one, if we found similar results in tropical areas, and two, we tried to take species from temporary habitats, from ponds, and from more permanent habitats such as streams, to see if there is a difference between these between thermal tolerances in predators and prey. What we found is something really interesting. In all habitats we analyzed, both ponds and streams, we found that heat tolerance was higher in predators, in Odonata predators. But we didn't find any difference between cold tolerance between predators and prey. But we didn't find any difference between these difference across elevation or across microenvironments. We also thought that species from temporary habitats, communities in temporary habitats should show broader margins, broader predatory margins than species from stream habitats, because temperatures are quite constant in stream habitats, so we wouldn't expect that predators should be adapted to higher temperatures. It doesn't have any reason, but well, that's really interesting. Also, we are now working too in modeling physiological distribution models. We use these models because normally the typical spatial distribution model uses working information, which is not microclimatic information per se, and they also use realized niche as if it was the fundamental niche. So to really have a fundamental niche, we have to make experiments, physiological experiments. So, for instance, those correlative models, what they see is, well, with climate change, what will happen to these species, for example. What we see is that all models suggest that these species will only increase in distribution because they are heat-adapted species. However, there is a limit. The correlations like suggest that they can live better even with higher temperatures, when that's probably not true, when probably a lot of populations will disappear from low elevation areas. So what we first did, we created climatic models, and we created climatic models based on variability of the habitats. We use three different kind of climatic models, one for high variation habitats, for temporary ponds, another one from medium variation habitats, which are temporary or non-temporary ponds, but with forest ponds, forested ponds, shadow ponds, and finally we used a low variation model, which is related to streams and deep permanent ponds. And those are the climatic models we made. The blue lines are the climatic models we created, and the green and red lines represent real temperatures on the habitats we modeled. As a species, we used we used poison dart frogs, which do not appear on those photos. Poison dart frogs are quite interesting because they are distributed at a broad elevational range. They can be found above 2,000 meters of elevation, so that's a very interesting group. And also they have a pattern of, as I said before, a pattern of one species substituting another species with elevation. So that's really interesting. So to obtain, we here obtained all the information that thermal performance curves can provide us. So what we used is the growth rate. We maintain those individuals at different constant temperatures during 10 days, and we measure the initial and final weight to obtain a growth rate, and use different models to fit our curves. So those are the species we work with. Here the green line is the growth rate, and the pink line is the survival of each species at each temperature. And yeah, and we used, sorry, I was forgetting, we used those species normally live in those medium habitats, medium variation habitats, and low variation habitats. So they are river species or species that live in ponds, shadow ponds. And we use the high variation habitats as a deforestation model. So normally those species are not found in open temporary habitats. So we use this model in case of deforestation. What will happen in case of deforestation? So we joined those two models, the climatic and the physiological model, to obtain that. In black we have the observed distribution of the species, and in blue, green, and red we find the distribution of the species according to our physiological models. Basically, what we found that is really interesting, and we will find it easily, is that optimum temperatures doesn't change at the same rate that mean temperatures. The dotted line is the exact variation for one another, and we found that this variation is not exactly the same. So we found that low elevation species are currently living, their mean temperatures is similar to their optimal temperatures, so they are living in optimal temperatures in this moment. However, species from high elevation areas, they are currently living in mean temperatures that are quite lower than their optimum temperatures. So high elevation species are currently living in suboptimal temperatures, which is really interesting and for many reasons, because probably those what we're finding here is that probably climate, from a theoretical point of view, climate change might be good even for species from high elevation areas. Here I took two of the most extreme species, Iloxalus machalilla, which is a species that is found near the level of sea, and Iloxalus pulchellus, which is a high elevation species found above 1900 meters of elevation. So yeah, we are using two extreme species, and what's interesting here is that we are analyzing the data in three different environments: low environments, which are normally found now; medium environments, which are those environments that are also found, that are ponds in forest habitats; and finally those high environments, which are that is like this deforestation model. What we found is that temperatures at present, which are the blue, we found that in high elevation habitats, species will be now endangered. will have problems to live. So, however, when we see the other models, we see that even within the worst models of climatic models of 2070, we find that no population would be exposed to stress. However, when we see the high variation data, we see that even in the current now, species will be affected for climate change. So it seems that deforestation or changing the habitats may have stronger effects than climate change itself. So to finish, I made a small discussion of what will happen to species in Ecuador. What we see is that low elevation species are exposed to stronger thermal stress than high elevation species. High elevation species are less exposed to thermal stress. However, we would expect that, and also we would expect that net loss diversity will be higher at low elevation areas, because in the tropics there are no other species in lower elevations or lower latitudes that can substitute those species. However, at high elevation, we don't know exactly what negative effects can have new interaction with new species that may colonize those new regions because of climate change. Also, there is a problem that amphibians normally seem to have low capacity of dispersion. So it's probably that a lot of those species would not be able to move to higher elevations. And finally, species from high elevation areas, even if they want, they don't have anywhere to move than to the heavens. So thank you very much. As always, this kind of work is done with so many collaborators, so many people that helps to do this kind of work. So I want to thank all these people and all these institutions for helping me. And I think I've gone a little bit fast, but thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'm here to respond them.
Thank you very much, Paul. Well, that was a lot of information, and it's amazing how much work you have done through your study in Ecuador. It's amazing. It has probably been so nice to drive across the country and studying these animals there. While questions come from the YouTube, I have a personal one. We have done this analysis relating a bit of the realized niche of amphibians with the thermal physiology, basically concretely with the maximum temperatures of the hottest populations of each species across world amphibians. And we found, despite what many people consider, that when amphibians are nocturnal animals that live, they hide buffered in very wet and well protected places. We found a very strong restriction of thermal physiology, CT max, critical thermal maximum, on the maximum temperatures of the place where they will inhabit. And surprisingly, we didn't find as a higher restriction for reptiles. Based on what you saw, you also made similar or somewhat similar analysis relating fundamental and realized niche in amphibians. Did you have any observations that they can be very restricted by the thermal tolerance? Like, did you find signs of thermal risks that the amphibians commonly commonly find? Because this is something that reviewers ask me. Like they say, how could you find this correlation if these animals are all the time, hidden? When it's
I think there is a correlation. Obviously, there should be a correlation. However, for me, it's difficult not because we have another work with terrestrial amphibians, with mantis, and we found also that in shelter habitats, there is also a high variation in maximum temperatures. So we find that species that use shelter in open habitats also have higher. So when you are doing this kind of macro climatic work and you are not considering the micro habitats these species are living in, I think it's difficult to kind of find. Maybe if you work with a lot of species, you will find a trend. But if you look locally, I don't know how you find this kind of correlation. You will find a correlation when you have a lot of species, but when you are going on a specific place, I don't think you will find that with macroclimatic data, because there are differences in CITIMAX because species also uses different shelters, and those shelters are exposed to also different maximum temperatures. Mm-hmm. What are really similar are minimum temperatures, but not maximum.
So do you think that possibly the amphibians, despite being able to hide in wet places underground, they might still find very high temperatures while they are burrowed, while they are hidden? That could actually actually kill them because they are too hot.
Here in Ecuador, we've seen that some of those plants reach very high temperatures in open areas. So it might. I think the thing is that what we found is that critical thermal limits are not the best to define. Are the best to define where a species cannot be, but not where species are. Okay. So what we know is that, for instance, species from high elevation areas, we have measured some of their habitats, and they do not reach temperatures never closer to the CITIMAX or what's happening here. But we know that there is there should be another variable, a better variable to know where species are distributed. Because, for instance, when we are analyzing species here in Quito, I'm not sure, but when we're analyzing species from above 2,000 meters, we are seeing that they have a very high CITIMAX. While when we are analyzing species from, it's quite difficult, but CITIMAX is not all the picture. That's my answer.
Yeah, but it's just that it struck me that there will be correlation at all.
I wouldn't expect any correlation.
Measuring some place in the distribution with the critical thermal maximum. That's what it struck me. But okay, I don't want to monopolize the discussion. Do we have any other question, please?
I also wanted to say thanks so much for giving this really interesting talk. I mean, it's really impressive data. So because you spoke about dendrobatids or poison dart frogs, I seem to recall vaguely having read a paper once about frogs choosing the container of water, the bromeliads or something that they lay their eggs in, and that the temperatures differ. So there's sort of a selection on the part of the parents to choose sort of microclimates that are more optimal. Did you notice those kind of patterns that there's a choice in temperatures for tadpoles?
We wanted to do that. However, we haven't done that. So, especially what's interesting to me is that we want to do that because some species have a quite big distribution in elevation, and what we are seeing, we haven't analyzed it yet, but what we are seeing is that species choose similar microhabitats similar habitats with similar temperatures across all the elevation. So at low elevation, those species are normally found in very shallow habitats, while at higher elevations, we found those same species in higher variation habitats, in kind of a little bit more open habitats. And what's really interesting here is that sometimes it happens something contrary to what is expected. So because those species are found those populations are found in open habitats at higher elevations, we found that CP max sometimes is a little bit higher in those high elevation populations than in the low elevation populations, something contrary to what we would expect. We would expect that the species from low elevations that should be exposed to higher temperatures should show that. The other thing that is difficult to do that at locally is that here in Ecuador we don't have that much, we don't have ophagas or ranitomeyas, which are two of the most. We have some, but not as Peru, Colombia, or other countries, which have more of those species that bred in bromeliads and other small habitats. Here in Ecuador, we have other species, Loxalus, Epipodobates, which uses rivers and ponds near the rivers. So it's a bit more difficult to find this high variation on small habitats.
Very interesting. Paul, would you say that this variation, this altitudinal variation in vulnerability is mostly due to the difference in microhabitats available at the different sites? Like you would be expecting more vulnerable species when you have a lot of forest, actually?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, but a difficult one to respond. When we are doing these analyses, we are analyzing the temperature to which they are exposed to now, and so if we find the tadpole in a pond, we are measuring the temperature of this specific pond, and because we know that they can live in this pond, but we don't know if they can live in a river or they can move to other sites. So maybe they can, and some species indeed can be found in different areas. For instance, we have Rhinella marina, which is impressive species because we find this species in level of the sea, but also near Quito. There is one population in the lower Quito. So it's above 2,000 meters. But also these species can be found in streams. They can be found in temporary ponds. It's like everywhere. Wow, it's like everywhere. So yeah, when we are analyzing, it's difficult to measure vulnerability in these species in comparison to another because they'll probably use other habitats without any problem, while other species, especially river-restricted species, are river-restricted species. So if the river disappears, the species disappears. So it's quite difficult. I think that because of results, what's interesting is that locally, maximum temperatures and also physiological upper like CP max is also very variable. So what I think is important here is that climate change will have a problematic in the tropics because species are actually exposed to extreme temperatures, but within the tropics, within a specific groups and along all the elevational range. So the problem, what we're finding is that the problem is those vulnerability studies we should concentrate on effects on different groups, on different habitats, more than effects on latitude or altitude, because what we've seen is that locally CP max is very variable. Like we found species in like Agathroteca at high elevation habitats that have higher heat tolerances than species from the level of the sea. But that also happens in latitude. We have species from Antarctica that have like also very high heat tolerances and similar to the ones we found at low elevation areas in the tropics. So CTMax is very variable, and we should work with habitats and we should not work only in differences in elevation and latitude, but also between environments, microenvironments. Okay. What will happen to them?
Very interesting. So across all the species that can share a locale, probably only a few that are really vulnerable because they have these lowest levels of critical thermal maximum, right?
So generalists will survive. There will be a lot of species within each that are generalists that I'm sure will survive, but within all elevations we will find some species that will disappear because of climate change, but not only because of climate change. One of the main problems here in Ecuador is deforestation, deforestation. So deforestation have a stronger effect and in a smaller window of time than climate change. So it seems that deforestation is one of the main problems rather than climate change. Climate change climate change is a problem, but deforestation is a bigger problem because in just a question of seconds, temperatures increase, not seconds, but in a few.
Everything is gone, right?
Everything is gone, and temperatures increase 5-7 degrees. So yeah. Sometimes we were thinking climate change. Well, here in Ecuador we have other problems. We have the problems of climate change, but we have a lot of other
more
problems.
Pressing ones. Thank you, Paul. Do we have anybody coming from YouTube, Chris?
Yeah. So, question from Paula. No, sorry, from Alice through Paula's account. So she's asking if species of low elevation are more vulnerable to climate change in short time than species of higher elevation. So could it be reversed, like of the long-term effects, as the changes are more extreme in higher elevations? I'm not sure if I read that well.
Yeah. There are a lot of things that I thought I had less time, and I had more time to talk about those stuff, and it will be great to to give more time to those areas. We analyzed two different things. We analyzed one effects, short time effects and long time effects. So for short time effects, we have CTmax and CTmin, and for long time effects, we have thermal performance curves, such as the one I showed you, the growth rate curve. So what we see is that there are two things. One is like a heat wave that can just finish with the population in 1-2 days. And there are like constant effects that have constant high temperatures that are not near to CTmax but have a long time effects or detrimental effects on those species. So what we are seeing is that it's similar to the question I responded before. So it's quite more difficult. Some species, especially river cichlid species, are actually exposed to very detrimental temperatures. So yeah, we will find some species that at low elevation areas, but also at high elevation areas, that will have long-term effects. Probably low elevation areas are more exposed to short-time effects because the maximum temperatures they're exposed to are very close to the CTmax, to the heat temperatures they can tolerate. But at high elevation species, they have more long-term effects, which also may be a problem, and also it varies between habitats and everything. But our data on CTmax suggests that low elevation species the difference between CT max and CT min is lesser, and if we expect a similar increase in temperatures across the whole elevational gradient, we will expect that low elevation species would be more exposed to thermal stress or even extinction.
Okay. Okay, I think that those were all the questions from YouTube. Well, Paul, thank you very much again for your time and for showing us all this amazing data from Ecuador. And thank you everybody who is watching. Please remember, this PhD student, remember to fill up the Google form, and see you all not next week, because not next week is Holy Week, so it's holidays, but the following one, I think it's the 21th of April, April 21st. So see you all around, and have a good week. Bye bye.